Dr. CH here. In our final discussion of microbe-human interactions, we're going to talk about epidemiology, which is the study of disease in populations. By the end of this video, you should be able to summarize the goals of epidemiology and the roles of the CDC, differentiate among the various types of reservoirs, providing examples of each, list 6 different modes of horizontal transmission, providing an infectious disease spread by each, define healthcare-associated infection, listing the most common types, list Koch's postulates, and explain alternative methods for identifying an etiologic agent, identify why some diseases are notifiable and provide 4 examples of such reportable diseases, differentiate between the terms incident and prevalence, discuss the 3 major types of epidemics, and identify the epidemic curves associated with each, and list examples of emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases. Reservoirs are where pathogens persist. A reservoir is a primary habitat in the natural world from which a pathogen originates. This could be a human or animal carrier, soil, water, or plants. Source is distinct from a reservoir. This is an individual object from which an infection is acquired. Living reservoirs include animals other than humans and arthropods. They can be directly transmitted to humans. They can be transmitted to humans via vectors, or they can be transmitted through vehicles such as water. Or you can have actively ill humans. Indirect transmission, a person with a cold contaminates a pen, which is then picked up by a healthy person. Or direct transmission, a sick person sneezing on a healthy person is an example. More living reservoirs, you can have human carriers. A person who is fully recovered from his hepatitis but is still shredding hepatitis A virus in his feces uses suboptimal hand washing technique and then contaminates food which a healthy person ingests. An incubating carrier of HIV who does not know she is infected transmits the virus through sexual contact. Or you can have arthropods such as fleas, mosquitoes, flies, and ticks. When an arthropod is the host and reservoir of the pathogen, it is also the mode of transmission. A carrier is an individual who inconspicuously shelters a pathogen and can spread it to others without knowing. You can have asymptomatic carriers. They're infected but show no symptoms of disease, for example gonorrhea, genital herpes, with no lesions. You can have incubating carriers. They're infected but show no symptoms of disease, for example infectious mononucleosis. You can have convalescent carriers. These are recuperating patients without symptoms. They continue to shed viable microbes and convey the infections to others, for example hepatitis A. We can have chronic carriers. These are individuals who shelter the infectious agent for a long period after recovery because of the latency of the infectious agent. For example, tuberculosis or typhoid fever. Or we can have passive carriers. For example, medical and dental personnel who must constantly handle patient materials that are heavily contaminated with patient secretions and blood risk picking up pathogens mechanically and accidentally transferring them to other patients. So these would be various healthcare associated infections. In epidemiology, a live animal that transmits an infectious agent from one host to another is called a vector. The majority of vectors are arthropods. A biological vector actively participates in the pathogen's life cycle, serving as a site in which the pathogen can multiply or complete its life cycle. Communicates the infectious agent to the human host by biting, aerosol formation, or touch. Whereas mechanical vectors are not necessary to the life cycle of an infectious agent, they merely transport the pathogen without being infected. As an example, a mechanical vector carries a pathogen on its body from one host to another, not as an infection. For example, if a fly picks up a pathogen from fecal matter and carries it on its body, the fly can then transfer the pathogen to food, and the person eats contaminated food and then gets sick. A biological vector carries a pathogen from one host to another after becoming infected itself. For example, an infected mosquito bites an uninfected person. The infection spreads through the body and into the red blood cells. A second mosquito bites the infected person. The mosquito may now transmit infection to another person. Zoonosis, an infection indigenous to animals but also transmittable to humans. Human is the dead-end host and does not contribute to the natural persistence of the microbe. Spread of disease is promoted by close association of humans with animals. People in animal-oriented or outdoor professions are at greatest risk. Examples include rabies, West Nile virus, anthrax, plague, ringworm, tapeworm. Non-living reservoirs. Microbes have adapted to nearly every habitat in the biosphere: soil, water, air, and the built environment. Most are saprobic and cause little harm to humans. Some are opportunistic. A few are regular pathogens. For example, the tuberculosis bacterium can be directly transmitted to humans when they come in contact with contaminated soil, water, or air. Communicable disease occurs when an infection host can transmit the infectious agent to another host and establish infection in that host. Contagious, the agent is highly communicable, especially through direct contact. Non-communicable does not arise through transmission of the infectious agent from host to host. Horizontal transmission, that's where the disease is spread through a population from one infected individual to another. Direct contact transmission, kissing and sex, for example, Epstein-Barr virus and gonorrhea. Indirect transmission, fomites, vehicles, parenteral, via injection into deeper tissues. And vector transmission. Vertical transmission is transmission from parent to offspring via ovum, sperm, placenta, or milk. With indirect transmission, we have vehicle, any inanimate material commonly used by humans that can transmit infectious agents. Fomite, an inanimate object that harbors and transmits pathogens, which is not a continuous source of infection. Oral fecal route, fecal carrier with an inadequate personal hygiene contaminates food during handling, and an unsuspected person ingests it. Water and soil can harbor microbes that can sicken humans. Can also become temporarily contaminated with pathogens that come from humans. Indoor air can serve as a support medium for the suspension and dispersal of respiratory pathogens via droplet nuclei and aerosols. Droplet nuclei are dried, microscopic residues created when microscopic pellets of mucus and saliva are ejected from the mouth and nose. Aerosols are suspensions of fine dust or moisture particles in the air that contain live pathogens. Healthcare-associated infections. Infectious diseases that are acquired or developed during a hospital stay or stay in another healthcare facility. Rates of healthcare-associated infections can range from 0.1 to 20% of all admitted patients. Medical asepsis, practices that lower the microbial load in patients, caregivers, and the hospital environment. Surgical asepsis, ensuring all surgical procedures are conducted under sterile conditions. The infection control officer implements proper practices and procedures throughout the hospital. They're charged with tracking potential outbreaks, identifying breaches in asepsis, and training other healthcare workers in aseptic technique. An essential aim of the study of infection and disease is determining the etiologic agent or the causative agent. Robert Koch developed a standard for determining causation of disease that stood the test of scientific scrutiny. He determined the causative agent of anthrax. Koch's postulates are a series of proofs that establish classic criteria for etiologic studies. For example, let's say you take a healthy organism, examine their blood, and you do not find a causative agent. In contrast, you have a diseased organism, you take a sample of their blood, and find a suspected agent. Now, the suspected causative agent must be absent from all healthy organisms, but present in all diseased organisms. The causative agent must be isolated from the diseased organism and grown in pure culture. You then take the culture agent and infect it into an organism. The culture agent must cause the same disease when inoculated into a healthy, susceptible organism. And then the same causative agent must then be re-isolated from the inoculated diseased organism. Epidemiology is the study of diseases on the community. It involves the study of the frequency and distribution of diseases and distribution of disease and other health-related factors in defined populations. Reportable diseases, these are notifiable diseases. By law, some diseases must be reported to authorities. Other diseases are reported on a voluntary basis. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention are responsible for keeping track of infectious diseases nationwide. They're part of the U.S. Public Healthcare Service. Morbidity and Mortality Report is a weekly notice of diseases published by the CDC. The CDC shares its statistics on diseases with the World Health Organization for worldwide tabulation and control. Prevalence of disease is the total number of existing cases with respect to the entire population. Incidence of disease measures the number of new cases over a certain time period, also known as case or morbidity rate. Mortality rate measures the number of deaths in a population due to a certain disease. Point source epidemic is one in which the infectious agents came from a single source. Common source epidemic results from common exposure to a single source of infection that can occur over a period of time. Propagated epidemic results from an infectious agent that is communicable from person to person and is sustained over time in a population, whereas a pandemic is the spread of the epidemic across continents. Index case is the first patient found in epidemiological investigation. endemic is an infectious disease that exhibits a relatively steady frequency over a long time period in a particular geographic locale. Sporadic disease is occasional cases are reported at irregular intervals in random locales. Global issues in epidemiology include increase in infectious disease incidence. This can be from newly identified microbes like HIV, SARS, or novel strains of influenza, or re-emerging diseases such as dengue fever, tuberculosis, and yellow fever. This has been your overview of epidemiology, which is a study of disease in populations. Until next time, this has been Dr. Sage.